We're going to be enjoying our deconstructed apple pie search. While we hear from Kathie Obradovich. I'm So I'm going to introduce Kathie, and Kathie is going to speak with us a little to some places history, culture, and politics of this beautiful state of Iowa. So Kathie Obradovich is editor-in-chief for Iowa Capital Dispatch, part of a national not-for-profit news organization. She leads an experienced staff covering state news and politics and writes a weekly column. Since the Iowa site launched in January 2020, more than a dozen Iowa newspapers and news sites have been regularly publishing Iowa Capital Dispatch content. Kathie has worked for more than 30 years reporting experience, has more than 30 years reporting experience in Iowa. She has worked for 16 years at the Des Moines Register. Most recently as opinion editor and political columnist. Between 1987 and 2003, she worked as a reporter and editor in the Des Moines Bureau for the leading enterprises newspapers in Iowa and the Quad City Times in Davenport. She's been a regular reporter on Iowa Public Television's Iowa Press and a frequent guest on other state, national, and international news programs. She has also served as a lecturer for Iowa State University's Greenwood School of Journalism and Communication. She's an Iowa State graduate who grew up in Ames. With no further delay, I want to introduce Kathie Obradovich.
Thanks for inviting me, and thank you for that lovely introduction. I'm actually thinking about giving you a deconstructive speech for your deconstructive dessert, because having met some of you, and I apologize if I didn't get to meet all of you, but I think you guys are going to have a lot of questions, is my guess. So I'm going to try to deconstruct my remarks just a little bit, and maybe see what questions you have about Iowa, or about politics, or Iowa caucuses, maybe the dear departed Iowa caucuses, we don't know, the media. I've got lots of opinions about that, so we can just talk, and that might be more interesting than hearing what I put down. But I'll give you a little bit, because I promised I would tell a little bit about the history and culture of Iowa. And I've been a journalist in Iowa, actually really for nearly 35 years, not to age myself, but, and I have covered statewide government and politics for most of that time. And I mentioned the Iowa caucuses, and every 4 years, you can set your watch by it. The national media comes to town to cover the presidential caucuses and to give us the bad news about Iowa. Guess what? We're white, and we have more kids than people. And while those are actually facts about Iowa, they are undeniably true. You look at our demographics and our livestock census. People are understandably anxious to make sure that this is not the only thing that you know about Iowa. In fact, in 2012, a couple of local characters created a video called Iowa Nice. Do you remember this, Nancy? So this video went viral. And it was things that, it sort of aimed at the national media in a way, but things that you don't know about Iowa. And I actually would have shown you this video tonight, except for the number of not so nice F-bombs. But Google it. Most of you will enjoy it, probably. It's called Iowa Nice. The point of the video, though, was to remind people that Iowa has been a pioneer in areas really beyond just innovations in animal husbandry. So, for example, civil rights. Our state was one of the first to legalize gay marriage. Iowa was home to the first female lawyer in America. To Iowa, my alma mater, Iowa State, was the place where the first I have to get this right because you have to be very specific. That first automatic electronic digital computer was invented in Iowa. So this was not COVID's, okay? But if, room-sized computers are not your thing, the inventor of Pinterest was also from Iowa. So, yes. Iowa was, you mentioned education. Iowa was ahead of the rest of the nation. School desegregation. Iowa is a home of the bread slicer. So if you like sliced bread, think of Iowa. Also, the trampoline was invented in Iowa. So you can see our state is making a number of really important contributions to the world. So, but I mentioned education. One of Iowa's claims to fame has been education. In fact, when the Mint created the state quarter, Iowa's quarter was an image of a one-room schoolhouse that was, by the way, based on a painting by another famous Iowan. Who knows it? Grant Wood. Exactly. Of course, the Iowa State University librarian is all about Grant Wood. And the words foundation of education are on the quarter. And so, and education is really the foundation of a lot of Iowa. The state government, the largest share of our general fund budget without fail goes to education every single year. While other states have moved ahead in some aspects of student performance for Iowa, Iowa still maintains one of the best rates in the nation for high school graduation. And, so that is, even in a year when budget's tight, which by the way is not this year, you see education getting a significant increase. That does not mean, however, that higher education gets a significant increase. And I can delve into that. That may be part of the speech I leave out, and you can ask me about it if you want. But that, just this year, I'll just throw it out there. The legislature zeroed out any increase for the state universities in a year when just about every other aspect of state government got, an increase, a little bit. That's true. A little bit. So anyway, some of the reason why that happened, there's sort of maybe a long answer. And there have been a lot of demographic and political shifts in Iowa. In my lifetime, Iowa has been a blue state, almost all of my lifetime. And the legislature's gone back and forth between Democratic and Republican control. The governor, while we had Republican governors for 50 years, and it was just two guys, for 50 years, pretty much. We did have two Democratic governors before it went back to one of the first guys got to be governor again, and then his proteges. So we've got a little bit of a dynasty going. But Iowa has had a lot of demographic and political change. In 1910, so 110 years ago, over half of the state's population lived in rural counties, and less than a third were in what passes for metropolitan counties in Iowa. And 100 years later, we're seeing the reverse. Only a quarter of Iowans in 2010 lived in rural counties, and over 43, over half are in metropolitan counties. Okay, so that's a difference. And actually, if you watch that Iowa Nice video, they will say 4 out of 5 Iowans live in cities. And then there's probably an expletive at the end of that. So, but anyway, so this has had a big effect on education, as you can imagine. The Des Moines Register, my former employer, reported in 2015 that since 1950, over 4,300 school districts had closed. And a lot of that is through consolidation. I think I'm pulling this figure out of my head, but I think that same article said that the geographic area covered by a single school district had increased by 14 times during that period. Iowa now has 333 school districts, and that's down 11% from what it was in the year 2000. So that shift is continuing, and that's a big challenge for education in Iowa. And so politically, I mentioned Iowa spent a lot of time as purple state. And somebody has mentioned the fact that we spent years and years with both Tom Harkin as the sort of progressive, well-known progressive senator, and Chuck Grassley, who is more conservative than he used to be. I mean, I think his party he's kept in line with his party. He might have been moderate when he started being elected, but those two guys, were routinely elected and re-elected. And I think Tom Harkin would still be there if he had decided to retire, or his wife decided he would retire, which I think is probably closer to the case in 2014. And I have to say, I don't have this written down, but I would have to say that Tom Harkin's retirement was part of the reason why Iowa looks the way it does today, because Tom Harkin was the untitled head of the Democratic Party in Iowa, and he chose the candidates, and he really ran things, and there was a great leadership when he retired. So. But he's sailing around the Bahamas and having a great time. So we don't begrudge that. Iowa hasn't always been kind of the purple swing state that most of us remember. In the 19th century, Iowa became a state in the 1840s, voted Republican for president every year since Franklin Pierce was elected. Iowa broke its streak in 1912 to vote for Woodrow Wilson, and then went right back, didn't like another Democrat till FDR. But between 1988 and 2012, Iowa voted for Democratic presidents 6 out of the 7 elections. Iowa voted for Barack Obama twice. He won the Iowa caucuses. Iowa is often credited, including by Barack Obama, to launching him to the White House. They voted for him for re-election, and then voted for Donald Trump twice. He won in 2020 by 8 percentage points, so he won handily in Iowa. And currently, I think any view of Iowa would say deep red. Iowa's deep red, at least for now. Republicans hold the majority. We'll change the federal legislature and the governor's office, so we get a trifecta. The House Speaker, who is, by the way, Chuck Grassley's grandson. We don't have dynasties in politics, when we do. He likes to say that Republicans represent at least part of 97 out of Iowa's 99 counties. So one of those 2 counties is Johnson County, which is the home of the University of Iowa. Who knows what the other one is? Can you guess, Sharon? Iowa State? Iowa State? No. Sarah Florida. Oh, no, I looked at, I thought it might be Sarah Florida, I looked it up, and you got a Republican in part of that county. Right. You. It's Chickasaw. It's Chickasaw, and Pritchard. The House Minority Leader represents parts of 3 counties, and that's one. And so that is the only other county besides Johnson. Chickasaw is more central.
Near Mason City or someplace.
So yeah, it's kind of near Mason City. Yeah. So you have by way of sort of explaining how a legislature that's kind of rolling in the zeros out for higher education. If you look at where Democrats are the strongest in the state legislature. It tends to be in counties where state universities are located. You set aside partisanship, and most state legislators do not live in a district where there is a state university, right? So because of the way the Iowa budget is put together, in lean years, in particular, when you have to decide whether to give more to K-12 or to community colleges or to the Regents universities, kind of vote with who's in your district, right? And that is not, for the most part, the Regents. So they have been working harder in recent years to help the rest of the state understand why they're relevant. I would say they have more work to do. So I'm going to answer part of the question about what happened this year. The other part, I think, just has to do with the nationalization of partisan issues. There was a short version, I think, is that there, at each of our three state universities in the last year, there were some mistakes made with regard to freedom of speech regarding some conservative students. And there was an incident at each of the three. All of them resolved in the favor of speech ultimately. But I think that there was a little bit of punishment by the person involved in the budget decision. And there also was passing a specific legislation related to First Amendment training, which, as a journalist, I happen to think it's a really good idea, just to try to make sure that doesn't happen again. There was also more serious than ever consideration given to ending tenure at public universities. And so far, at least the business community, which is very serious about the kind of research that gets done at state universities, especially ag research, but also other research, has so far had a line on that particular piece of information. So, and then I'll just circle back to the Iowa caucuses just for a second, because it does remain to be seen whether Iowa will continue to have first in the nation status. It's always in jeopardy, more so now than usual, for some fairly significant reasons. But candidates are already coming to Iowa for 2024. So I always say that if the candidates are here, then the media will be here. And if the candidates and the media will be here, then hey, we've got caucuses. So I'm good, but that also gives the national media a lot more opportunity and incentive to let everybody know what's wrong with Iowa. So I'm going to stop there and just give you a chance to ask some questions. Yes, sir.
I have a couple. The first one I want to ask you. I'm from Ohio. We have a term in the state for legislators and governor. I was curious, what's your explanation about the longevity of Terry Branstad, 6 terms as governor?
Yes.
And Grassley having 7 terms and maybe an 8 to be Runstad.
Yeah.
What do you attribute your success to?
Partly really, really hard work. In particular, I would say nobody works harder than Terry Branstad, at campaigning than maybe Chuck Grassley. I mean, both of them. So one of my former colleagues at the Des Moines Register coined the term of full Grassley, which means you visit every one of Iowa's 99 counties every year. And that's not easy to do. But Chuck Grassley does it, Terry Branstad did it, Kim Reynolds is doing it. Especially during COVID, I think that made a difference because when people see you in their town and know you, and Terry Branstad was one of the most gifted politicians I'd ever met in terms of being able to, meet somebody and then see them 4 years later and, ask them how their mom's doing and, oh, your kids, Mary and Sally, and just had a really amazing, well, maybe he just had amazing staff, I don't know, but I think he had an amazing memory for all of that. So that's part of it. I also think that during the political, back when those guys were first running, they could be moderate. They could work across the aisle. they could compromise. And they got things done as a result. They were able to get things done for the state. People were not that political. There were a lot of people who would disregard the party and vote for the person. I think those people are getting rarer and rarer in politics today. When Tom Harkin retired, I said, we're never going to have another senator who stays in office for 20, 30 years. And the same when Chuck Grassley retired, we'll never have another, I don't think we'll ever have another senator who stays in office that long, regardless of any term limits. You mentioned term limits, so for our members of Congress, redistricting is a term limit. Because we in Iowa are one of the few states in the nation that have nonpartisan redistricting, completely nonpartisan. The maps are drawn by nonpartisan legislative staff. The legislature has to vote the maps up or down. They can't amend them until they get to the third map. If they don't make it, ultimately the Supreme Court draws the maps, which we're now in a weird situation because the census data is not coming until we should have it in March. It's not coming now. They said September. Iowa has a September 1st deadline to draw its maps with the Supreme Court. That's right. So that'll be a big constitutional test that we're on for this redistricting process. So redistricting is actually terminating for members of Congress, for members of the House. We've had incumbents thrown together. We've had incumbents of the same party thrown together. Nancy can tell you, and I think Sharon can tell you, when you look at the legislative districts, the legislature pays attention to their district. Pretty much. If you like your district, you're not necessarily going to want to roll the dice on the next map. So the U.S. House and Senate, or the U.S. House is kind of on its own sometimes.
What about inside, outside money in Iowa?
Yeah. So outside money has become a big issue with some elections. Certainly the U.S. Senate election gets a lot of outside money. There has been outside money involved in the congressional elections, not as much with legislative, although there leaders will get money from outside the state. We have been seeing more issues coming to Iowa. And I mentioned sort of the nationalization of some ideological issues. And so just this legislative session, for example, there was a controversy over Iowa's new election laws. And there was a national group called Heritage Action that a video was leaked of them taking credit for basically writing Iowa's law. And the legislators who wrote and ran Iowa's law were like, what? No, they denied that there was ever any in contact with Heritage Action. And they said, if this group was involved in doing that, then they're violating the state's lobbying laws, the ethics laws. So they did backtrack from that a little bit. But I think they could have still been telling the truth about pushing legislation through a grassroots process, and people who don't have to register as lobbyists. So I do, that's an example of outside money working on getting legislation passed. And I tell you what, Heritage Action wasn't doing it. There sure were a lot of others that do. So I don't know if that answers your question. Yes, ma'am.
Can I ask a newspaper question?
Of course.
So, Chicago Tribune was just purchased. I don't know if you're aware that you probably follow all this.
Yes.
Yeah, I agree with you.
Yes.
Yeah. So I'm not sure who you're owned by, but what do you think the state of the press is with this?
Endangered. Endangered. So the newspaper industry is troubled, and we have been for quite a while. The phenomenon of hedge funds buying up newspaper chains is extremely, extremely concerning, because ultimately, what the process there is you buy these properties, you fire everyone, you shave as much money out as you can, and then goodbye. And that may be a great model for the shareholders. It is a terrible model for news consumers, and it's a terrible model for those communities that depend on independent news coverage. And that's part of the reason why our organization exists, actually. Because of the erosion of newspaper coverage, there is now a need, and there's sort of a growing trend of not-for-profit models, of which States Newsroom is one. Will be in 25 states by the end of this year. We added 5 states last year also. And this is, it's a philanthropic effort by people who care about news. They don't need to influence what we write, because all of our outlets are editorially independent. But the idea is to plug holes that are created by the erosion, particularly in newspaper staff. We just opened an outlet. I told somebody this earlier. We just opened an outlet in Montana, where until we had opened our newsroom, there were no newspapers covering the state government, state legislature, zero. And what about the taxpayers in that state? I've seen research where taxpayers end up paying more for their government services if they don't have strong community journalism in their community. The particular study I saw related to bond issues and how much communities would have to pay for bond issues, and that the lenders would look at the fact that there's no community newspaper and conclude that this local government is either inefficient or corrupt, and the price of the bonds go up. And so that it does affect taxpayers. And so that's why our organization not only charges while there is no free news, you can get news without a paywall on our site, but we also provide our content free of charge to newspapers around the state. My register picks up our copy. Occasionally the Omaha World Herald, Successful Farming, which is a Meredith publication, picks up farm news from our organizations. And we're hoping that will help those organizations focus on the strong community journalism that they do, and not have to worry about who's going to cover the state capitol. Yes, ma'am.
We just discussed because of money coming into the state. What happens because of the extreme polarization that we have witnessed? Does that affect the journalists to write freely and follow what they think they should do?
I can't speak for other journalists. I mean, I think that you have a situation, first of all, where you've got some partisan media outlets now. And in some ways it's going back to the roots of journalism. Journalism started where newspapers were basically party organs. They existed to promote a certain point of view or a philosophical perspective. And we're seeing a return to that. I think, as you started with the national cable networks, and there are some radio stations that are that way and on down. Newspapers, I think that they, occasionally deserve their accusations of being liberal media on occasion. But, I think that the people do try to, treat people even-handedly when it comes to news. And sometimes objective coverage is also criticized because, readers say, I want you to tell me who's right, not just what the sign say. And so that's, news consumers have a very particular interest. And I'm not sure I'm answering the question. Rephrase it if you need to. But I will say that, when you look at all of the actual news options that are available to you, I don't care if they're liberal or conservative, pretty much all of them are better than Twitter. Okay, being a source for news. So, from my experience, if you have a reporter that's actually going out covering a story as opposed to just all of the talking heads, that you might see on cable, I mean, most of the time you can at least trust the reporters.
So what's the most difficult thing for a journalist?
I think that the different journalists, they have different challenges, but one of the biggest things that worries me is the fake news. The idea that if you don't think it's positive news for you, then you're just going to say it's not true, that it's fake. Certainly undermining of the idea that news is factual, and that I believe that undermines our ability to agree on a shared set of facts. And if we can't agree on a shared set of facts, then it's going to be very hard to go forward with joint decisions. So that is what worries me ultimately. It's not just a journalism problem; it's a democracy problem.
What about taking away all the adjectives and adverbs in the Kathie report?
Well, I think it would be really bland. I teach, when I teach journalism, I try to teach them to use descriptive adjectives and adverbs and not judgmental ones. So, don't tell me this guy's tall, which is a relative term, right? Tell me how tall he is. Don't say he's stout. Tell me what his belt size is. I do think that's you can be descriptive without being judgmental.
How about one more question, Larry?
Well, does Iowa have the initiated measure process? Is it utilized a lot? It's not.
It is not. You don't have at the state government people petitioning to have referendums on things. Most of that comes from the legislature. Correct me if I'm wrong. We don't have that, right? But the legislature can put things on the ballot, but it doesn't.
My follow-up question would be, what role should the journalism group play in that initiated measure?
Reporting on the people who are initiating those measures, I think, telling you who they are and what their motivation is and how they're funded so that the people who are going to be ultimately voting on them are informed. Newspaper editorial boards weigh in on issues, sure. And that used to be my job. And I think that's an appropriate use for newspaper. I wish newspapers, anybody who writes opinion needs to make it very, very clear so that people know what they're reading. So on our site, anything that's not news is labeled commentary very, very clearly, so that people know the difference. I also, one of my little pet side issues is I really honestly think our country would benefit from a lot better civics education in terms of making people more better news consumers, so that they know the difference between news and opinion, so they can evaluate, when somebody's blogging on TV, whether what they're saying is factual. And I really think that we got to be doing more of that. Yeah.
Well, you just said one more.
One more from.
I do have a question. I'm really interested to know what you think will happen when those two constitutional amendments come up for a vote by the people and the outside money that might come in to influence them, not press, but just outside money.
Yeah, well, outside money is influential, regardless. I don't think it's the only thing that matters, but it does matter. And so the constitutional amendments that Sharon's mentioning are ones on abortion that will not be on the ballot. It can't be on the ballot until 2024. There's also one on gun rights that can be on the ballot in 2022. And, you know, is the timing advantageous for people who want to get conservatives to come out and vote in the midterms in the next general election? Yeah, I would say so. But it's also not the only, you know, these have been long time goals as well. So, and we could get into a lot of lawmakers versus judiciary, because that was a definite theme through the legislature this year. But I think that it's going to matter. It's going to matter not just for those referendums. It's going to matter also around the ballot.
Kathie, thank you so much.